A mother had less than 12 hours to find a husband or lose her son to the state. Ava Mercer was not failing as a mother. She was being crushed by a system that measures love in paperwork, income, and appearances. She had already escaped one violent man only to be told that devotion alone was not enough unless it came with a stable home and the image of a proper family. Then Vincent Caney entered the picture. A man shaped by power, secrecy, and moral compromise. A man who had mastered control in every corner of his life except the one moment he saw a woman quietly apologizing to a son she might never get to hold again. What makes this story so compelling is not just the rescue he offers, but the collision underneath it. Her survival shaped by fear and sacrifice. His shaped by dominance and emotional isolation. And the real question is devastating. Can two broken people build something real together, or are they only turning disaster into a slower form of collapse?
The chronometer begins its final revolution, 12 hours. This is the narrow window remaining before the cold, industrial gears of the judiciary permanently sever Ava Mercer from her offspring. She sits submerged in insolvency, crushed by a sociopathic ultimatum: secure a spouse and a residence by tomorrow's zenith, or surrender 6-year-old Eli to the machinery of the state. Midnight finds her isolated in a decaying diner, her psychological scaffolding finally buckling under the atmospheric pressure of her reality. She is a study in human wreckage, oblivious to the fact that a predator is cataloging her grief from the shadows. A man whose intellect functions with the precision of an algorithm. His impending proposal will serve as either a miraculous reprieve or the definitive strike that liquidates her world. The setting is Rosie's diner, a liminal space saturated with the hum of failing neon and the scent of carbonized grease. It is 15 minutes past midnight, and the external world has ceased to exist. Retreating into a corner booth, Ava's mental state is hemorrhaging, one fiber at a time, as she witnesses her entire biography evaporate into the void. She collapses inward, her posture a defensive crouch against the tremors of her own sorrow. Spread across the laminate table, the legal documents resemble shards of obsidian, the architectural plans for her total ruin. The bureaucratic decree is absolute: provide a functional domestic unit and a paternal figure by midday, or the narrative ends, March 15th. The calendar date serves as a tightening ligature around her throat. Gloria, a waitress, offers a caffeinated mercy, but Ava declines with a silent gesture. She lacks even $2 for a momentary comfort. Her indigence has become a maximum security prison from which there is no logical escape. The prospect of returning to her dilapidated tenement, where Eli rests under the indifferent supervision of a neighbor, is unbearable. She is a woman fleeing the ghosts of her own history. Half a year ago, she escaped the orbit of Marcus Chen, a cruel irony, as his name was once the synonym for the sanctuary she craved. Their 3-year union was a prolonged disaster of physical trauma and systemic betrayal. She became a master of cosmetic concealment until the moment his malevolence targeted the boy. That was the breaking point. She vanished with $17 and the visceral necessity of a mother protecting her young. This is a modern retelling of David and Goliath, yet the giant possesses all the leverage. Marcus utilizes his ancestral wealth to manipulate the legal system like a master of marionettes. Ava is a mere phantom, depleted by consecutive labor shifts, and attempting to wage a judicial war without a single partisan in her theater. Initially, a flicker of optimism remained. The tribunal granted her custody while distancing Marcus. However, he interpreted her autonomy as a personal affront. 2 weeks ago, he initiated a psychological, scorched earth campaign, rebranding her as a fractured, pathological entity to permanently reclaim the child. His legal counsel are architects of linguistic demolition, transforming her misfortunes into tactical armaments. They harvested footage of a mechanical failure and a solitary moment of emotional vulnerability in a grocery aisle, presenting them as empirical evidence of a shattered mind. It was a masterpiece of cognitive attrition. She is undergoing a systematic erasure by a bureaucracy that masks its cruelty as concern. The court evaluator offers a condescending smile while weighing her life against arbitrary metrics. To the state, her humble residence is a liability, and the 70-hour weeks she works to sustain Eli are interpreted as criminal neglect. She pleads for them to recognize the biological and emotional gravity of motherhood, but her testimony falls on sterile ground. The court prioritizes the aesthetic stability Marcus provides, a suburban estate, and a superficial replacement mother named Jennifer. To a judge, raw devotion is a valueless currency. Discovering that Marcus had already commodified her replacement was a psychological amputation. The magistrate's supposed leniency was merely a death sentence in a different font. 30 days to manufacture a middle-class existence out of thin air and insolvency. She spent weeks pursuing the phantoms of social welfare, an aid that never materialized. In a state of temporary insanity, she even explored digital matchmaking, searching for a stranger to play a role in her legal fiction. Then Marcus applied the final pressure, compressing her timeline to 12 meager hours. Panic is a localized frost. She petitioned a landlord with a heart of granite and appealed to social workers buried in a landslide of paperwork. Every portal of hope has been slammed shut. There is no one left to provide an answer. She attempted to reconnect with her own mother, a woman she had not contacted in years, only to find the line was a hollow silence. The isolation was absolute. Now she huddles in this diner, staring into the abyss of an existence where her son is absent. Her self-respect is a tattered flag. She dabs at her eyes with a coarse paper napkin, certain she is invisible within her catastrophe. She is mistaken. From the darkness of a nearby booth, a predator observes, a man who inhabits a stratosphere of power she cannot even fathom. Vincent Caney enters the narrative, a phantom draped in a custom suit. He is a man of boundless capital and zero compassion, currently in hiding following a lethal rupture with the Russian syndicate. His presence in this grease-stained sanctuary is a cosmic anomaly, a collision of two vastly different tragedies. Vincent is a man navigating the shadows, his vast empire under siege from Volkov's liquidation teams. He possesses the capacity for total annihilation, yet the perpetual hunt has left him spiritually bankrupt and exhausted. For the first time, his private fortress feels like a gilded cage. At 42, the walls of his life are contracting. He has constructed a kingdom of espionage and deception, winning a game where the only prize is an additional day of breathing. Now he examines his hands and recognizes nothing but the dust of his own making. He functioned as a man without attachments, categorizing love as a tactical flaw and human beings as expendable assets. He has no successor, no emotional center. The vacuum within him is the logical consequence of his pursuit of perfection. He was prepared to vanish back into his isolation when the sound of her lamentation arrested him. Typically, he is deaf to the global frequency of suffering, but there was a specific, haunting resonance in her despair that pierced his cynicism like a diamond-tipped drill. He monitors her from the gloom, his intellect scanning her like a high-definition optic. He interprets the legal documents and the tremors in her hands, deconstructing the puzzle of her life with clinical efficiency. He is not a man of charity. He is a man of solutions. His internal assessment, a woman in her 30s, physically eroded by labor and a deficit of sleep. A server named Ava. She possesses no remaining assets. Even her timepiece is a broken, worthless relic. She is a portrait of complete systemic collapse. Every logical impulse commanded him to depart. He operates in the realm of billions and bloodshed, not the parochial sorrows of a waitress. Yet he remains rooted, captivated by the pure, unadulterated wreckage of her spirit. "I tried, Eli," she whispers into the stagnant air, the sound of a human being surrendering to the dark. That name, That concentrated maternal agony penetrates a crack in Vincent's icy resolve. To witness a bond so absolute being liquidated by a man like Marcus offends his internal sense of order. He has spent a lifetime avoiding the chaotic mess of human connection. A child is a statistical variable he would never permit. Yet the sound of her disintegration activates something primal. The predator stands and emerges from the shadows. Gloria is paralyzed as he moves past her with the terrifying fluidity of a wolf. Ava does not look up. She is fixated on a photograph of a 5-year-old boy, a face radiating the kind of joy she is about to lose for eternity. He possesses a striking countenance, Vincent remarks, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. Ava recoils, her pupils dilating with the fear of a woman who has been systematically broken as she attempts to hide her legal documents. "Forgive me," she stammers, the conditioned reflex of the subjugated. He towers over her, a figure of dark sophistication and latent power. He is 6'2", of high-end wool and silver-threaded hair, his eyes deconstructing her soul like a manuscript. "There's no need for apologies," he says quietly. "I observed your world ending and decided to intervene." She produces a sound that is a collision between a laugh and a sob, anticipating his mockery. But he remains. He observes her with a terrifying analytical focus. Not with sympathy, but with the recognition of one survivor identifying another. "I am not here to inflict harm," he vows with lethal certainty. "I have the capacity to stop the bleeding." Ava's response was a jagged defense, a cynical rejection of the miraculous. She attributed her hostility to the crushing weight of her circumstances. Vincent's gaze drifted to the legal debris she was attempting to conceal beneath her trembling hands. "A struggle for your child?" She bristled instantly, a wounded mother protecting her nest. Vincent retreated slightly into the gloom, providing space, but as he turned to depart, her silence fractured. "They are taking him?" she bled out, a raw, desperate admission. Vincent turned back with a heavy, deliberate elegance. Ava was a study in total collapse, her eyes burning as she fixated on Eli's image. The ultimatum cast a shadow over the booth. 12 noon tomorrow to manifest a home and a husband, or the father seizes the boy. "It is a mountain I cannot scale," she whispered, burying her face in her hands. Vincent stood motionless, a strategist evaluating the ruins, a ticking clock and a woman without armor against a ruthless apparatus. It was not his struggle, yet the hollow chamber of his heart was suddenly processing a different set of numbers. He watched the dim light reflect off her damp skin. Logic dictated he walk into the night, but his own existential vacuum demanded he stay. "What if we resolved both requirements by sunrise?" he asked softly. Ava's hands dropped, her eyes wide as she searched his face as if he were reciting a forgotten alien script. The atmosphere grew dense. "What did you say?" "A residence and a ring. Precisely the variables the judge requires." He maintained her gaze, the architect of her next chapter. Ava let out a sharp, fractured laugh. "Have you lost your mind? Do you realize how irrational this sounds?" "Absolutely," he replied, his face a mask of cold stone. "I am suggesting we marry." The words lingered like smoke in the frigid air. Ava recoiled, her pulse racing in her throat. "You are delusional. You do not even know my name." "I know you are a mother on the verge of losing her soul," he countered, his voice a low, unwavering hum. Ava's voice vibrated like a raw nerve. "What is the hidden motive?" she asked. He saw a woman drowning in bureaucratic ink and midnight dread, with only 12 hours of hope left. It was a valid suspicion. Within Vincent's fractured psyche lay a maze of shadows and a sudden, primal urge to play the savior. He could have unveiled the moral decay within his own soul, how his monuments of paper wealth felt like a gilded sepulchre. He might have confessed that rescuing her was a desperate grab for personal redemption or a palliative for his profound isolation. The possibility of this deception manifesting into a reality flickered. Yet, he maintained his psychological fortress. Instead, he projected a clinical detachment. I possess idle capital. You possess a void that requires closure. I am the bridge. Ava's expression shifted with a reflexive skepticism. Altruism of this magnitude does not exist. There is always a hidden liability, a hook concealed within the gift. Every transaction has a cost, he conceded. Skepticism is your survival mechanism. But consider the cold arithmetic. What occurs at 12 noon if I simply walk away? The logic struck with the force of a physical impact. Her internal defenses began to fracture. Precisely, he murmured. What remains to be sacrificed when your world has already vanished? She searched for an exit strategy, but the calculus of her agony led back to this enigma. I am socially obsolete, she whispered, acknowledging her total lack of leverage. Currency is merely white noise, he answered. Vincent was not seeking a financial return. He was searching for a new vessel to house his vicarious redemption. My singular objective is ensuring your son remains in your custody, he stated, his voice a deep, resonant frequency. The remainder is purely administrative. Ava scrutinized his features, looking from the megalomania of a madman. She discovered only a terrifying, calculated stillness. Identify yourself, she insisted in a fragile, breathless tone. Vincent Caney. The moniker carried no weight for her. She existed far from the industrial violence and steel upon which his empire was constructed. To her, he was merely a sophisticated, sanitized predator. I am Ava Mercer, she replied. If this is a psychological game, I will personally ensure your end. This is no amusement, Vincent interrupted, his tone as final as a tomb door closing. You have my solemn commitment. The commitment of a stranger is worth nothing. Then permit me to provide the evidence. He moved into the booth with a measured slowness, encroaching upon her life without triggering her flight response. Present the documentation. Let us analyze how we secure a victory. Ava hesitated before surrendering the legal burden. Vincent processed the text with the efficiency of an algorithm, his face an impenetrable barrier of neutrality. Upon finishing, he looked up, the synthetic neon glow highlighting the flinty hardness in his gaze. A residence in a premier district, a stable bank balance, and a legal union. He allowed the implications to resonate. This is a simple task. In only 12 hours? She exhaled, her composure fracturing. If we initiate the process immediately, he responded, rising from the weathered leather seat with a sudden, decisive grace. Vincent activated his phone, his mind rearranging the pieces on a global chessboard. I own a 4-bedroom estate in Riverside Park that currently stands vacant. You will relocate tonight. My legal counsel will expedite the marriage filing instantly. We do not possess a single second to squander. The bureau opens at 8 in the morning. We are legally bound by 9. We shall have the certificates by 10. He articulated the plan with the surgical precision of a high-stakes heist. Ava felt the foundation of her reality dissolve. This is a hallucination. The world does not operate on such terms. Desperate paradigms require a necessary monster, Vincent observed. You are at a total loss. I am the solitary exit remaining. Ava's paranoia reached its zenith as she scanned for the moral fine print. What is your endgame? Are you intending to? She could not articulate the fear. He did not require her to. I shall not touch you, he declared, neutralizing her terror. This is a utilitarian covenant, not a domestic intimacy. Separate quarters, absolute boundaries. Once the child is secure, we will dissolve the union and depart. No complications, no lingering shadows. This is merely a legal transaction intended to preserve a life. It was a masterpiece of psychological choreography. Every instinct signaled a trap, yet a flicker of hope suggested a miracle. I require specific regulations, Ava maintained, her voice strained by her remaining resolve. She was currently negotiating with the demon to secure a sliver of her own paradise. Define them. Vincent produced a pen and a napkin. Separate sleeping arrangements, no physical contact, no personal obligations. He recorded the terms instantly. Accepted. What else? Eli is my singular priority. I remain the sole decision-maker for him. You must remain entirely excluded from his life. Agreed. However, I require the truth regarding your history. I refuse to introduce my son to a house of ghosts. This was the ontological precipice. Vincent had spent decades concealing the stains on his hands. Now, to secure her cooperation, he would offer a carefully curated version of his own reality. Vincent adopted the persona of a morally ambiguous titan, framing his dominion as a sequence of difficult choices. He compartmentalized his darkness, promising Ava a sanctuary for her child. Ava's physical reaction was visceral, a primal response to the apex predator inhabiting the space across from her. These gray areas were a psychological minefield of trauma and enemies. Ava's heart hammered against her ribs, sensing the heat of a distant fire. Caney suppressed her rising panic with a vow of absolute security, a maneuver designed to foster total dependency upon his strength and his shadow. He positioned himself as both her architect and her guardian. Ava was a fragmented mosaic of exhaustion and a tiny, irrational hope. Her focus remained on Eli, who dreamed in his bed, blissfully unaware of the man who had just purchased the rights to his entire future. She thought of Marcus, a man who found joy in her degradation. The system had already categorized her as insufficient. Consequently, Ava ceased her flight and placed her ultimate wager on the stranger in the booth, exchanging her autonomy for a chance to protect her heart. Ava strikes out with a mother's hollow ferocity, resembling a cornered animal snarling at a deity. She clings to the boy as her only psychological anchor. It is a tragic, aesthetic display of a woman attempting to maintain the illusion of choice in a world that has already decided her fate. A phantom of a smile touches Kane's lips. He respects the dormant predator within her, the survival instinct of the vulnerable. Under his clinical gaze, her terror begins to undergo a metamorphosis, festering into a dark and complex form of psychological dependency. The covenant is ratified in the cold breath of a whisper. At exactly 12:47 in the morning, Kane initiates his administrative surgery. He operates with the icy detachment of a man issuing a death warrant, irrevocably binding her existence to the trajectory of his shadow. He evaluates her life with a butcher's clinical eye. The neighbor, Mrs. Chen, is merely a loose thread in a disintegrating safety net. 7 in the morning, he commands, and Ava feels the irresistible tide of his willpower pulling her beneath the surface of her own life. He views the oxidation on her derelict vehicle not as a tragedy, but as a tether. Her desperation is his primary capital. He emphasizes the dawn deadline, making it evident that he has become the sole arbiter of the air left in her room. As he diagrams their departure, Ava's consciousness begins to fracture. She observes herself navigating a waking delirium. While she drifts, he constructs a gilded cage of marriage certifications and asset ledgers, building it brick by heavy, legalistic brick. He instructs her to rest, his voice saturated with a condescending benevolence. Ava erupts into a fragmented, manic laughter at the absurdity of union with the monster. He merely observes her, his countenance a mask of bored, aristocratic indifference to her suffering. He discards a stack of currency like a financial shroud, a reminder of who controls the light. He utilizes the child's requirements as a whip to steer her toward her bed. Her hands tremble uncontrollably as she attempts to gather the ruins of her former identity. "Because it is within my power," he states, a demiurge justifying his own lightning strike. Then he evaporates into the biting March atmosphere. Ava stands solitary in the vacuum, a survivor in the center of a wasteland that used to be her home. The server, Gloria, recognizes the wolf and attempts to alert the lamb, but Ava already displays her teeth in his defense. The deception is taking root. She must believe her captor is her savior, or she will suffer a total psychological collapse. The gloom of the drive carries the flavor of ash and impending storms. Tomorrow's judicial hearing looms like a gallows. While she contemplates the choice between the abyss and this demon, Cain is already manipulating the fundamental levers of the world. The apartment has become a tomb of stagnant air. Little Eli sleeps, white-knuckling a plush dinosaur, oblivious to the fact that his mother just conducted a metaphysical transaction to keep the lights burning for his sake. She murmurs a commitment to the darkness, a plea for a child who cannot hear her. She holds his small hand, feeling the immense gravity of her decisions. He is the singular force, preventing her from drifting away into total erasure. At 3 a.m, a text message glows like a digital warning beacon. "Bring the child's toys," he dictates, a tactical maneuver for a seamless assimilation. The legal execution commences at 8:30 a.m. "Sleep," he commands, like a king from a distant throne. She pleads for a justification, a single fragment of rational logic. He demands only her total silence and her absolute faith. Her heart beats a frantic, uneven rhythm against her chest, rendering sleep a phantom she can never quite apprehend. She recognizes this as a form of insanity, but in a world that seeks her termination, this is her final card. She is bartering her name for the opportunity to breathe. At 7 a.m, the black vehicle arrives like a mechanical hearse. 7 a.m. arrives with the low, velvet hum of a luxury engine. Her entire existence is compressed into 2 inexpensive bags. She constructs a narrative about a new adventure for the boy, masking the scent of the trap with the anesthesia of hope. A man named Thomas appears, his attire representing a value greater than her entire life. Eli retreats, sensing the cold, sterile air of the elite. The transition is visceral. They are no longer autonomous citizens, but human acquisitions of the Cain Empire. They migrate through the city's scars into its opulent golden center. Eli gazes at the radiant glass monoliths, astonished by the sudden shift into luxury. Ava watches from behind the privacy glass, a ghost traversing a landscape of unimaginable wealth. "Are we of the elite now?" the boy inquires, his voice a testament to years of scarcity. They arrive at a grand brick estate bordering the park. It is not a fortress, but a cinematic stage set designed to simulate the warmth of a home. Cain waits upon the stairs, his sleeves rolled up in a calculated performance of domestic warmth. It is a masterpiece of deception. He projects the image of a husband and a father, but beneath the linen shirt, the predator remains vigilant. The boy hesitates, sensing the existential shadow. Cain descends to one knee, diminishing his physical presence to appear human. He mirrors the child's small gestures with a terrifying, rehearsed grace intended to extinguish a mother's final doubt. He masters the vernacular of childhood wonder, constructing a prehistoric sanctuary to ensnare the boy's loyalty. Ava witnesses the mechanical click of the snare with a chilling relief, her psyche splintering under the weight of their shared fabrication. The residence is a curated exhibit of amber lighting and intentional clutter, a domestic stage set that rejects the label of a cage. It masquerades as a redemptive sanctuary, a vivid mirage designed to dissolve Ava's final instinctive fortifications. The child's quarters are a submerged world of cerulean hues and ancient predators, a psychological womb functioning as a gilded cell. Kane observes the boy's assimilation with the detached, clinical scrutiny of a biologist peering through a lens. The illusion claims its first victim as Eli surrenders to the fantasy. Kane provides a facade of autonomy through trivial decisions before severing the warmth with surgical precision. "The legal counsel is assembled," he declares, his tone as flat as a tombstone. He allocates an entire level to her, a palatial sprawl for a woman accustomed to nothingness. This opulent surplus induces a moral vertigo. "Everything is for the child," he asserts, weaponizing her son's identity to camouflage the dark geometry of his own fixation. She drifts through the corridors in a fugue state, momentarily eclipsing the violent history staining their agreement. He abruptly terminates the dream. In this cold architecture, the only currency that retains value is the ink and the statutory power he carries like a blade. Terror transmutes into a frantic adrenaline as they approach the courthouse. A predatory litigator awaits, armed with a paper trail designed to annihilate history and red tape. The iron bars are swinging into place, silent and absolute. The attorney operates with the ruthless efficiency of a falling blade. No inquiries, no hesitation. Ava scrawls her name as directed, her verbal responses reduced to a mechanical resonance. She abandons the quest for why, opting instead to merely float in the wake of his momentum. Under the sterile vibration of government lighting, they perform their scripted roles. He initiates a kiss, a frigid, calculated collision of flesh that carries the antiseptic flavor of a corporate merger. Affection is absent. There is only the structural integrity of a pact. Her pulse strikes a frantic rhythm against her ribs as the signature dries. The metamorphosis reaches its conclusion. To the state, she is no longer a fugitive in flight. She is a sovereign within his realm, permanently shackled to his orbit. They address her as Mrs. Kane, a title that sears into her identity like a hot iron. With 90 minutes remaining until the tribunal, his hand settles on her shoulder. It is not an act of tenderness, but the tightening of a tether before the ritual sacrifice. "Your victimhood has expired," he murmurs, fundamentally reauthoring her internal narrative. "You are my property." As Eli plays, Ava recognizes the true conflict is yet to manifest. The judicial system was merely the starting line, while Kane himself is the grueling marathon. They enter the hall with the terrifying grace of deities descending from on high. Kane projects an aura of dominance that makes the stone walls feel frail. His legal proxy carries the dossiers intended to enter her history forever, bending the law into a personal instrument. The monumental architecture casts long, oppressive shadows over the broken individuals gathered in the foyer. Elena's respiration falters. Her history has become a physical burden. Beside her, Leo tracks the drifting dust, his purity eroding in the clinical atmosphere. A quiet murmur and a calculated deception preserve the boy's fragile reality. Leo searches for Adrian's palm, attempting to fill a paternal void with a ghost. They project the image of a nuclear family, a flawless, devastating mimesis of devotion. Adrian has successfully purchased the child's allegiance with kindness and luxury. They traverse a hallway saturated with the scent of chemical disinfectants and abandoned hopes, a necropolis for the domestic collapses that preceded them. The hallway is populated by expressions of raw sorrow. Sarah guides them into the shadows, her gaze hunting for vulnerabilities. She consults her timepiece, performing a final inventory of their survival odds before the magistrate's hammer descends. The atmosphere shifts as Marcus breaches the room. Elena's physiology reacts with the frantic rhythm of a captured sparrow. He offers a smile, a meticulously choreographed display of warmth that fails to mask the lupine predator prowling beneath his skin. Marcus audits Elena's features like a reclaimed asset before shifting his frigid attention to Adrian. Elena interposes herself, a maternal force shielding her progeny. The men exchange a silent appraisal, the unspoken introduction to a coming slaughter. Marcus hurls a jagged barb intended to demoralize. Adrian remains unmoved. His gaze is as relentless as an Arctic blizzard. Elena tilts her chin upward, brandishing her gold band as if it were a consecrated shield. The sheer weight of his rival's stature drains the vitality from Marcus's face. He falters, dismissing their alliance as a pathetic narrative, a transparent script composed at the final hour to intercept his perceived inheritance. Sarah retaliates with the rhythmic poise of a master orator. She recontextualizes the marriage not as an impulse, but as a clandestine sanctuary kept hidden from Marcus's toxic and manipulative reach. The adversaries' counsel, billing $500 every hour, mocks Elena's sudden financial ascent. He characterizes her wealth as a statistical impossibility. Sarah remains unyielding, asserting that this union exists beyond the reach of his cynicism. The defense cites the riverside property, a sprawling fortress of capital standing against the claims of destitution. Marcus recalibrates, softening his delivery and adopting the persona of a grieving father for the benefit of the gallery. The bailiff's voice signals the start of the ritual. Elena's extremities turn to ice, her pulse audible. Adrian's hand provides a grounding pressure against her spine, a silent anchor reminding her that her days as a casualty are over. Elena attempts to inhabit her new authority. She crosses the threshold into the chamber where the air is heavy with the scent of decaying parchment and the looming inevitability of a classical tragedy. Judge Thorne occupies the bench, her countenance a cartography of fatigue and skepticism. She peers over the rim of her spectacles, prepared to dissect the necrotic remains of this shattered domestic unit. The audit commences. The tribunal scrutinizes the administrative wake of Elena's life, questioning if a mere 30 days is sufficient to synthesize a stable environment from the ruins of a catastrophe. The chronology was rewritten this morning. Patricia unveiled the files with theatrical precision. Elena wedded Vincent Caney just yesterday. Their official residence is located at 847 Riverside Park Drive, a prestigious 4-bedroom estate. Legal documents and property deeds were presented like consecrated artifacts. Judge Brenner analyzed them with a cold, analytical eye. "Your response," she prompted. Brennan rose, his features contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. "This is a theatrical absurdity," Brennan snarled. "A few months ago, she was destitute and shattered. Now, mere hours before this hearing, a savior materializes. This isn't a holy union, it's a desperate, amateurish forgery. This timeline reflects her resolve, not her deception," Patricia argued. Brennan insisted on a direct interrogation. A visceral dread settled in Ava's chest. She felt like a bird navigating a landscape of closing snares. She was mentally unequipped for the witness stand. Her physical coordination betrayed her as she crossed the floor. Marcus watched with predatory focus, while Leo's bewildered expression pierced her more deeply than any accusation. "What is the duration of your acquaintance?" Brennan inquired, his voice laced with synthetic empathy. Elena's thoughts spiraled. She murmured that it was recently, then corrected to several months. The fabrication tasted of blood and metal. No photographic evidence, no digital footprint, not even your own kin was informed. Brennan paced with the focus of a wolf. Elena's airway constricted. The silence in the chamber became a void where her future had once stood. He unveiled her mother's treachery. Elena's breath hitched in her throat. "Is it not a fact," Brennan whispered, leaning closer, "that your first encounter with this man occurred in a diner a mere 48 hours ago?" Elena looks toward Vincent. He offers a nearly imperceptible nod, a directive to incinerate the facade with the truth. Patricia interjects, her voice a frantic plea for the court to disregard the temporal impossibility. "The chronology is the evidence," Brennan shouted. "She purchased a spouse. She recruited a total stranger with a murky, suspicious history to perform in this legal drama for the sake of a child." Patricia's protest was a desperate cry in a dark room. Brennan bypassed it, delivering a substantial file to the magistrate that detailed Vincent's clandestine world, the shell companies and the tainted capital that financed their sanctuary. The judge's expression hardened into granite. She turned her attention to Vincent. "Stand and address the court," she ordered. Vincent rose, his jaw rigid, the only tell of the tempest raging beneath his bespoke tailoring. "Have you ever been the subject of an inquiry?" A dramatic, cinematic silence followed. "On several occasions, I have never faced a conviction." He outlined his holdings, property and logistics, in a voice as frigid as a headstone. "Your associates are ghouls," the judge observed. Vincent's gaze remained unwavering. "I do not curate the population of the global marketplace," he replied, his candor as sharp as a surgical instrument. Ava detected a faint instability in his tone. He wasn't arguing his innocence, merely the absence of a verdict. Judge Brenner sighed, shutting the file with a definitive wooden thud. "Mrs. Kane, resume your place on the stand." Ava's fingers intertwined in a desperate, bloodless grip to stabilize her trembling frame. "I have a simple binary inquiry," Judge Brenner said, her tone shifting to a chilling, clinical intimacy. "Is this a union of spirits or a transaction of necessity? Is there a legitimate connection, or is this a calculated gambit to circumvent the law?" Ava stood at the precipice of a classical tragedy, forced to choose between a lie and a truth that might hollow out her very existence. Ava's gaze shifted from the purity in her son's eyes to the obsidian resolve of her protector. In the quiet gravity of the room, she spoke with a resonance that felt ancient and weary, acknowledging a marriage born of necessity but fueled by truth. She described her new husband as a bastion of quietude amidst a shattering existence, offering a dignity her previous life lacked. When the attorney struck with accusations of a legal farce, he was merely weaponizing the language of doubt against her. Hardening her posture, she framed their union not as a deception, but as a radical act of salvation for a soul in ruins. The prosecutor sneered, characterizing her sanctuary as a parasitic bond with a phantom from the criminal abyss. The term nurturing acted as a catalyst for her suppressed trauma, prompting her to dismantle the artifice of Marcus's fatherhood. She prepared to expose the clinical coldness of emergency room logs that documented her supposed accidents. As the salt of her grief traced lines across her face, she detailed the violent history etched into her very skin. Marcus's composure dissolved, revealing the cornered predator beneath his polished exterior before the judge's command silenced his outburst. The magistrate's analytical facade remained frozen as she probed for a formal declaration of domestic battery. Ava's confirmation was a fragile yet unbreakable thread of sound, explaining that her previous silence was a byproduct of total, systemic terror. She articulated the imbalance of power, his golden guards against her absolute nothingness. She had viewed a quiet disappearance as the only path to safety, realizing too late that the scales of justice often favor the wealthy over the working. She wept for the realization that her poverty was scrutinized more heavily than her ex-husband's cruelty. Her hasty marriage to Vincent was a choice for a man who nurtured her child's imagination rather than stifling his spirit with fear. Their union was a lifeline thrown without expectation, a reality that defied the sterile charts of the court. Judge Brenner observed this confession with the detached precision of a scientist examining a specimen of profound human desperation. The bench turned its focus toward Marcus, whose simmering resentment was beginning to boil over. The defense dismissed her testimony as a collection of ghost stories, citing a lack of official reports as proof of her alleged fabrication. Vincent's voice cut through the air like a heavy blade, announcing the existence of suppressed evidence. He rose with the calm of an executioner, holding a device containing the digital echoes of past screams and hospital records he had recovered. This tactical strike shattered the procedural rhythm, leaving the courtroom suspended between clinical awe and moral fury. The judge gestured for him to approach, her expression hardening into a mask of iron as she sought a private revelation. The magistrate's face calcified as she processed the digital ledger of pain. With a single sharp motion, she called for a 30-minute hiatus to weigh the gravity of the horror reflecting in her eyes. The environment transformed into a pressure cooker of high-stakes friction during the break. While the opposing lawyer spat venomous accusations, Vincent remained a granite cliff, letting the man's rage break harmlessly against his stoic neutrality. Caney had granted her the agency to either burn the bridge or keep her secrets. Despite her physical tremors, Ava experienced a tectonic shift in her soul, choosing to confront the brutal reality of her past without flinching. Her legal team attempted to ground her with rhythmic breathing exercises as they braced for the next phase of the conflict. However, the sudden chime of the elevator signaled a new, predatory presence that sent a flash of terror through her. A group of career wolves entered the space with rhythmic, calculated grace. At their center was a mountain of a man whose very presence forced Vincent into a coiled, combat-ready posture, shifting the atmosphere from legal to lethal. Dimitri initiated a psychological assault, using a honeyed dialect to mock Vincent's transition from a shadow player to a delusional protector. He framed the entire courtroom drama as a trivial game of house played by a common waitress. Ava felt the temperature of the room plummet as she recognized the monsters from Vincent's warnings. Dimitri wore a mask of feigned innocence, daring his rival to shed blood within the hallowed, high-security walls of the institution. The intruder attempted to frame the situation as a fiscal oversight, a flaw in Vincent's armor. Even as he sought a 5-minute reprieve to settle his debts, the bureaucratic clock of the court ticked on without mercy. The villain presented a classic, tragic dichotomy: the preservation of an empire or the safety of a girl. Ava felt the familiar grip of panic, fearing the moment Vincent would decide she was no longer worth the cost of the war. Instead of violence, Vincent utilized the authority of the setting, branding his enemies as agents of witness intimidation. He effectively turned the judicial system, once his greatest adversary, into a personal shield against the underworld. With a few lethal words, he seized control of the narrative, prompting the security detail to swarm the intruders. Dimitri and his unit were dragged back into the shadows, briefly restoring a clinical order to the halls of justice. A bloody promise was hurled over his shoulder as the doors sealed the threat away. Vincent watched them go, acknowledging the persistent shadow of the debt but keeping his focus on the immediate prize of the trial. When proceedings resumed, the opposition appeared as hollowed-out shells of their former selves. The magistrate began her final analysis of the dossier, which provided an empirical map of the violence Ava had endured. The records acted as a grim choir, singing of shattered bones and midnight sirens that Marcus could no longer deny. The judge's gaze stripped away his narcissism, revealing the violent phantom that had long hidden behind his wealth. The court brushed aside frantic legal objections, noting that the evidence was an immovable mountain. The judge admitted that while Ava's new life was unconventional, the child's safety was the only light that mattered in this dark landscape. Ava braced for a strike of condemnation that never arrived. Instead, the judge saw a woman who had constructed a fortress out of sheer necessity, choosing a dark guardian over a golden monster in a desperate bid for survival. The bench recognized the father's litigation as a twisted noose of control rather than an act of love. The judge's cold evaluation shifted toward the boy, weighing his future against the sanctuary he had finally secured. Identifying a complete lack of safety in the father's residence, the judge orchestrated a final decisive movement. She cut his desperate pleas short, bringing the curtain down on his long reign of shadows and manipulation. The mother retained her child while the father was relegated to the periphery of supervised visits. For the new couple, a 6-month period of institutional scrutiny had officially commenced, serving as a high-stakes sentence of surveillance. The judge extracted a solemn oath of devotion, causing Ava's composure to finally fracture. Her sob echoed through the room as the sharpest blades of her legal nightmare finally withdrew into the darkness. The court challenged Caney's stoic facade, reminding him that a child requires a father's heart rather than a strategist's move. He bowed his head, his low "I will" sealing a pact before the room finally emptied. As the gavel's thunder faded, the adrenaline evaporated into a heavy silence. The boy whispered of his dinosaur-painted sanctuary while the father was led away, his jaw tight with a silent, murderous fury. The father's eyes projected a bloody sequel of vengeance yet to come. On the marble steps outside, the lawyers discussed Caney's 11th hour evidence as a masterpiece of manipulation in a high-stakes war of minds. Their counsel advised them to maintain the artifice, suggesting 6 months of playing house to satisfy the state. They would need a trail of bank statements and practiced smiles to sell the fiction of a functional union. Under the harsh afternoon sun, Ava whispered her profound gratitude. Caney's mask softened momentarily as he proposed a simple dinner, a grounded act intended to bind their secret alliance and comfort the boy. The child's spirit seemed to rebound from the trauma of the day. Ava understood that the wolves were still circling, but as she leaned on Caney, she realized she was no longer facing the dark in isolation. Caney stood as a monolith, his hand on her shoulder a steady and heavy weight. A single, profound glance passed between the protector and the rescued, forging a bond in the heavy silence of their shared victory. He vowed a resolution, his words serving as a heavy anchor for her drifting spirit. She chose to trust his deception once more, a classic submission to the man who became her sanctuary. They departed for a fortress of high stone. The path ahead remained obscured, yet the crushing weight of despair had finally lifted. Little Eli chattered about prehistoric beasts and treats, entirely oblivious that his existence had nearly been extinguished. Ava sought Vincent's hand, finding a grip as unyielding as iron. They had ceased their flight. They were now combatants in a shared, tactical struggle for survival. They paused at a local diner 3 blocks away, a neighborhood haunt where the faces were familiar. Eli devoured his meal, lost in fantasies of new playthings, while Ava's throat constricted with the bitter, persistent ghost of her recent terror. Vincent observed her tremors for 10 minutes before breaking the silence. He attempted to ground her in the mundane, rest, food, the child, but her internal alarms continued to scream at the looming shadows. Dimitri's memory haunted every corridor of her consciousness. Outside, Eli explored the new play, set Vincent had constructed overnight, his small hands moving with caution as if the very earth beneath him might dissolve again. "He must understand that the foundation is secure," Vincent remarked, sliding a coffee across the table as a silent gesture of reconciliation. When she questioned the courthouse confrontation, his features hardened, a glimpse of the predatory nature hidden beneath the surface. He identified the threat, the Volov organization. He was attempting to sever his ties, and they were intent on making him pay in blood. He presented the cold reality, the illicit trade, the hidden lives, staring her down with unflinching honesty. "I claim to be a phantom. This is the price for manifesting in the light," he confessed. Ava felt her reality fracture. She and the child were merely currency in a grander criminal ledger. For a fleeting moment, his remorse stripped away the monster, revealing something painfully human. The organization demanded their tribute and his total compliance. Vincent clenched the edge of the counter until his hands turned pale, attempting to climb toward the light while the criminal element dragged him back into the depths. To the organization, walking away is the ultimate betrayal of blood. Ava's pulse raced. She understood that his vow of safety merely transformed them into the most high-profile targets in the entire city. Vincent argued his confinement was superior to the life her ex-husband offered. He provided security and barricades, yet Ava looked at the surveillance feeds and recognized only a different iteration of captivity, established on a foundation of violence. He maintained he possessed a strategy for liberation, a complex deception designed to dismantle the Volovs. He was playing the role of a double agent, feigning loyalty while weaving a lethal trap out of bureaucratic procedures and calculated falsehoods. Then came the revelation. He had been a federal informant for 6 months. He was dismantling the trafficking machine from its dark core. In sharing this, he placed his very existence into her hands, a final act of radical honesty. Only the authorities were aware. Ava's mind raced as the narrative aligned. He hadn't simply escaped prosecution. He had become the state's covert instrument, concealing the truth within plain sight to secure their future. He made no claim to morality. It was a calculated exchange, their survival for his redemption. He was methodically erasing his past identity to forge a life that the world might finally permit to exist. He described her rescue as his first action devoid of a hidden cost. A man who possessed everything, yet felt a void, finally finding a reason to exist within the desperate narrative of her healing. Vincent charted the depths of her psyche, then provided a heavy, almost clinical form of solace. The quiet was shattered. Vincent transitioned into a lethal guardian, watching over them like a sentinel. Marcus appeared. Ava felt her breath hitch as the specter of her past materialized before her. Vincent dismantled the fabrications Marcus presented with a cold, analytical, and legally precise counterattack. Marcus shouted his defiance. Vincent countered with a soft-spoken vow of total legal and social destruction. Threatening declarations sent Marcus retreating into the shadows of the turbulent evening. The tension remained high. An electronic breadcrumb had guided the predator to their door. Comfort was replaced by cold metal. Vincent insisted that Ava discard the mindset of a victim. Their agreement, born in a simple diner, evolved into a consuming and singular shared destiny. Observing Eli's lingering purity, Ava committed herself to this conflict, and to the man beside her. She signed her name to his terms, irrevocably weaving her fate into the fabric of his life. Ava searched for the leader within the cold, azure radiance of the command center. He provided a place of refuge. He is currently draining the resources of the Volkov organization. The Volkovs will demand retribution. The inevitable collision is expected within weeks. He analyzed the coming chaos, declaring her protection to be his most sacred mandate. She questioned his past. He revealed a rhythmic, scarred, and hauntingly dark recollection. He spoke softly of a father who was a monster and a mother's desperate attempt at flight. She passed away in a state of ruin, a young Vincent witnessed her final, agonizing surrender to despair. He channeled his early suffering into an unrelenting, almost pathological pursuit of influence. Protecting Ava served as an act of atonement for the woman he had been unable to protect years ago. Ava reached out to him. He remained a detached, analytical seeker of maternal phantoms. Her fingers met his. A flicker of possibility ignited within the heavy, expectant silence. A volatile attraction sparked between them. Ava pulled back before the flames could take hold. He vowed to serve as her protector, an unwavering and absolute foundation for her new life. A choreographed sense of normalcy prevailed behind the steel barriers for 21 days. Vincent stepped into a paternal role. Eli flourished while Ava transitioned away from her previous employment. They maintained the performance of a family until their separate paths became a singular knotted cord. Immense capital merged. Ava looked upon millions and felt the dizzying pull of a new reality. He ordered her to shed her poverty-born caution, a command that ushered her into a surreal world of inherited opulence. She began to navigate expensive boutiques without the familiar pang of anxiety, choosing fine fabrics for the boy and herself. A chilling departure from the desperate math of her previous life. Ava withdrew into a domestic sanctuary, curating evening meals to blunt the sharp edges of their existence. While Vincent navigated the brutal architecture of power, she provided the hearth. These dinners shifted from ritualized performance into the vital grounding heartbeat of a family forged in shadow. Bathed in warm light, Vincent performed the role of patriarch, dissecting childhood stories with the surgeon's precision. He transmuted his lethal empire into fables fit for a child's ears. Watching from the periphery, Ava felt her heart ache at the sight of a predator genuinely capable of love. Underneath this thin veneer of stability, the machinery of the underworld hummed with increasing intensity. Vincent would disappear for hours into his study's suffocating stillness, his voice a low tremor against the coming storm. The domestic atmosphere became dense and electric, heavy with the ozone of an inevitable collision. An investigator named Sarah Chen became a lingering ghost in their corridors. Vincent erected a fortress of silence around Ava, practicing a paradoxical form of cruelty. He believed that by shielding her from his transgressions, he could insulate her from the conflagration he had sparked. He discussed the Volkov threat with the detached coldness of formal execution, demanding she submit her autonomy to his guardianship. To sustain their delicate equilibrium, she suppressed her own terror, bearing his dark legacy like a silent penitent. On day 23, the quietude fractured. A call from a masked line breached her defenses, carrying a woman's clinical, sharp tone. When the stranger invoked her former identity, Ava corrected her with a mournful, steady dignity, embracing her status as a Cain. The caller was Jennifer Chen, the woman bound to the malevolent Marcus. The realization struck Ava with physical force. Jennifer proposed a summit of wives, two women trapped in the gravity of the same apex predator, their destinies suddenly and violently intertwined. Ava remained guarded, but Jennifer utilized the ultimate psychological lever, a veiled threat against the child. Maternal instinct overwhelmed the survivor's intuition. She pleaded for clarity, but the connection was compromised, and the truths were too dangerous to articulate. An encounter was arranged for 1,200 hours in a glaringly public space. No guards, no escape. Hanging up, Ava felt the world destabilize. She understood with chilling clarity that she was walking into a calculated snare, a theatrical trap designed by Marcus to lead her to her ruin. Still, the necessity of her son's protection pulled at her like a lunar tide. Vincent was preoccupied with legal combat. The boy was secured behind institutional barriers. A jagged, fleeting window of autonomy had opened, and she prepared to cross the threshold alone. She rationalized it as a calculated gamble, though her instincts screamed otherwise. In the fractured landscape of her history, anything Marcus influenced was inherently unstable. Ultimately, her obsessive need to protect the child clouded her logic, pulling her toward the flame. At 11:45, she left a fabricated note. Driving a nondescript vehicle toward Fifth Avenue, her hands shook against the steering wheel. The cafe, Common Grounds, was a stage crafted of brick and deceptive normalcy, waiting for the first act to begin. Jennifer was visible instantly, a woman constructed of expensive facades and frayed nerves. Upon Ava's arrival, the atmosphere hummed with friction. Ava stood with the posture of a monument, refusing the comfort of a chair and demanding the raw truth be laid bare. Jennifer begged for composure, her eyes reflecting a profound, chronic fatigue. She delivered a dark oracle. Marcus was weaponizing the legal system, intending to use Vincent's violent history to strip Ava of her child forever. Ava mentioned Vincent's federal immunity, but Jennifer's expression was a mausoleum. The truth was far more invasive. Marcus had been observing them, his presence lingering in every corner of the Kane residence. Ava felt the phantom sensation of his gaze crawling across her skin. The pursuit had lasted weeks, a methodical deconstruction of their sanctuary. Marcus had compiled an archive of their existence, fueled by a scorched earth fixation. Jennifer whispered a desperate warning. He didn't crave the child. He sought the total demolition of Ava's spirit. Overwhelmed, Jennifer revealed her own tragedy. She had been seduced by a monster's feigned vulnerability, only to be pulverized by his demand for total control. She was inhabiting the same airless nightmare Ava had narrowly survived, the volatility and the gilded cage. Jennifer explained that Marcus viewed individuals as property to be reclaimed, not loved. Ava felt a nauseating pity for her successor. Then Jennifer pushed a folder across the table, a lethal schematic of the legal traps Marcus had set for the Kane network. The documents outlined a systematic destruction planned for the coming week. This was never about paternal affection. It was about the refined joy of punitive ruin. Marcus was using their son as a surgical tool to perform a final public vivisection of Ava's heart. Their delicate peace dissolved as Jennifer grew pale with dread. Marcus entered the room, a surge of narcissistic fury. He was accompanied by men who carried not law books, but the cold, oppressive scent of wet asphalt and impending violence. He hurled the word traitor at his wife, his eyes flashing with a dark, proprietary rage. To Marcus, Ava's liberation was a personal affront, a breach of his perceived divine right to own her. He saw this meeting as a direct defiance of his absolute power. Then came the revelation. He had recorded the entire interaction with surgical intent. His smile was a sadistic masterpiece of triumph. He had her trapped, ensnared in a web of criminal association. Ava felt a surge of visceral panic as the cage closed. She pleaded for her son's future, her voice a fragile strand of hope. But Marcus remained impenetrable. He ridiculed her intellect, his tone dropping to that chilling, intimate whisper of a predator who has finally cornered his prey and intends to relish the moment. He mocked her search for a new guardian. Then, a fresh shadow emerged, a man with a voice like grinding stones and a Slavic inflection. He suggested they relocate to the dark. Ava's blood chilled as she recognized the sonic signature of a professional assassin. These were not Marcus's subordinates. They were the Volkov wolves. They viewed Marcus with open contempt, dismissing his theatrical posturing. In his blind thirst for vengeance, Marcus had invited the abyss to the table, partnering with the very demons Vincent feared. The assassin's stare settled on Ava, marking her as the ultimate tool to dismantle Vincent Kane. In his pathetic attempt to destroy her, Marcus had unbarred the gates for the wolves. He had traded her security and his own soul for a hollow, fleeting victory. Marcus maintained his moral delusions, claiming he was rescuing her. He had auctioned his family's secrets to the Russian syndicate for a chance at winning. The associate's eyes were predatory, signaling an immediate and terminal end to her autonomy. The choice was a razor: comply in silence or perish in the public eye. Jennifer, finding a final spark of defiance, tried to scream the truth: that Marcus had signed their death warrants. He silenced her with a glance, the tragic final act of a man consumed by his own shadow. Jennifer sparked a distraction, a desperate plea for them to vanish. The world dissolved into a smear of frantic movement as the threat took hold. Ava's pulse hammered against her ribs, a primal drumbeat of terror. She became a creature of pure instinct, protecting her secrets with every breath. A violent grip caught her in the shadows of the lot, the pavement becoming a snare. Then Kane stepped into the light, his eyes void of warmth. The husband had evaporated, replaced by a lethal apparition. Every trace of domesticity was gone, exposing the predator beneath. The Volkov operative remained firm, a snarl directed at Kane's frozen authority. Vincent dismantled the man's ego with a clinical, biting assessment of his incompetence. It was a macabre dance of monsters. The killer mocked Kane's domestic life, sneering at his wedding ring as a killer's noose. The turncoat suggested Kane's resolve had been poisoned by the comfort of a quiet life. He spoke of using Ava for a bloody re-education, a means to drag Kane back to the syndicate's fold. To them, she was no longer human, only a lever to be pulled until Kane fractured. Kane moved with the terrifying speed of a lightning strike, neutralizing the threat in a heartbeat. His eyes never left the enemy as he propelled Ava toward the vehicle. He threw her into the steel enclosure as the air vibrated with the tension of a terminal standoff. Marcus had vanished, his cowardice shining like a flare as the gunfire erupted. Inside the car, the driver's knuckles were white, his composure a thin veil for his panic. As the forest swallowed the path, the phone chirped, a direct conduit to Kane's metallic voice. Kane's tone was razor-sharp, heavy with the weight of a compromised operation. He lambasted her for violating protocol, his voice a low growl of cold fury. He acknowledged her suffering but demanded her silence. The woman he loved had become the one variable capable of incinerating his world. The countdown had expired, and the game had entered a terminal phase. With the Volkovs watching, Kane activated the federal contingency, setting the massive gears of the law in motion. He commanded her to seize the boy and flee, abandoning their entire existence for the sake of survival. Ava's spirit burns with an unyielding defiance, a desperate gambit against obsolescence. Yet Kane's cold pragmatism acts as a surgical blade, severing her emotional ties. He views her as a liability his mission cannot absorb. When he invokes the safety of their progeny, her resistance dissolves into a silent pact with the abyss. She retreats into a psychological cocoon, a wounded entity seeking sanctuary in silence. Kane migrates them to a digital void, erasing every electronic footprint that might betray their location. The trauma of the physical breach in the parking lot ultimately shatters her spirit, forcing a final embrace of the clandestine. A fracture appears in Kane's stoic facade, a rare admission of his own fallibility in the face of betrayal. The spectral flash of humanity is brief before the persona of the professional executioner resurfaces. He terminates the call with clinical finality, delegating the wreckage of her psyche to Thomas. The safe house stands as a domestic mausoleum, a hollow monument to her vanished reality. Within 30 minutes, her existence is reduced to a suitcase as she enters the vacuum of federal protection. Her identity remains tethered to Kane, a man dancing upon a razor's edge. A profound sense of displacement takes root. She has merely traded one gilded cage for another, This 2-hour northward odyssey feels less like a rescue and more like an internal exile. The wilderness imposes a physical weight where every organic sound echoes like a lethal discharge. Young Eli finds refuge in exhaustion, his mind a sanctuary from the surrounding tempest. His tranquil state serves as a cruel mirror to Ava's psychological disintegration. She keeps vigil by the window, her useless device a cold relic against the impenetrable forest. Thomas operates with the sterile efficiency of an architect, transforming the cabin into a digital panopticon. Electronic sensors act as unblinking sentinels charting her every movement. In this atmosphere of hypervigilance, her physiological needs are stifled by an all-consuming dread. Thomas's assurances of security dissolve into white noise. Ava occupies a borrowed purgatory, feeling the phantom reverberations of the violence Caney endures in the dark. 3 times in 2 hours, she reaches for her phone, a silent invocation desperate for a sign of his continued existence. The world outside has been surgically removed. In this sensory deprivation, she analyzes the bureaucratic remains of a stranger's life. Grainy imagery depicts Caney as a spectral figure moving illicit capital, the very portrait of a societal predator. Upon closer inspection, the forensic evidence reveals a different narrative. These aren't the impulses of a criminal, but the calculated strikes of an infiltrator. He is a surgeon using a data-driven scalpel to dismantle the Volkov infrastructure from its dark heart. Caney's objective is the total systemic collapse of an empire, a slow-motion demolition of capital. Marcus, fueled by a narcissistic wound, chooses to weaponize this truth for legal leverage. He is willing to immolate Caney's reputation for the sake of a Pyrrhic victory in court. A new variable emerges from the dossiers, a recurring female presence, a professional phantom. This constant companion in Caney's shadow world ignites a primal, territorial ache. Ava finds herself haunted by the specter of this unknown accomplice. Recognition finally crystallizes within her memory. The woman is no rival, but federal agent Sarah Chen. Marcus's surveillance had captured Caney in the service of the law, misinterpreting the reach of justice for a criminal conspiracy. The irony is devastating. The documentation meant to condemn him becomes his ultimate absolution. The sudden intrusion of headlights shatters her contemplation. Ava retreats to the floor, watching the light sweep across the ceiling of her dark refuge. It is not an assassin that emerges, but the man himself. Caney descends from his vehicle, his visage a topography of the conflict he survived. Despite his physical trauma, his arrival acts as a celestial intervention, pulling her back from the psychological brink. Her indignation vanishes, replaced by a desperate, crushing contact. He clings to her as if she were his sole anchor to reality. In their wordless union, his touch narrates the odyssey of a soul returning from a personal underworld. His voice is a scorched rasp carrying the weight of seen atrocities. He announces the decapitation of the Hydra. 4 simultaneous strikes have dismantled the Volkov syndicate in a single night. 18 operatives are neutralized, and the shadow is finally purged. The metamorphosis is finalized. The ghost has reintegrated into the light. Through hours of testimony, he has bartered his dark history for a fresh start under federal aegis. He has shed his predatory skin, emerging as a man accountable to the law. He releases a 6-month accumulation of tension in one shuddering breath. He has transitioned into the mundane world, leaving the moral gray behind. Ava weeps, finally perceiving the martyr within the man she once viewed as her jailer. Under the clinical glow of the lights, Caney performs a ritual of atonement, confessing to the hubris of his tactical errors. It was the fatal arrogance of believing he could isolate his demons. Simultaneously, the law consumes Marcus for his dance with the Volkov syndicate. The judicial blade descends upon Marcus, Using mercenaries to terrorize the mother of his child is a transgression the state cannot ignore. His pedigree may spare him a cage, but his prestige is incinerated, and his bid for custody is effectively strangled. The concept of liberation resonates with the finality of a bell. For Ava, this produces a disorienting vertigo. Their connection was built upon a foundation of shared trauma. Without a common enemy, the utility of their bond dissolves, revealing a psychological void. A whispered inquiry seeks a new trajectory for their lives. Caney, sensing the tectonic shift in their power dynamic, discards his warrior's mask. He descends from the role of protector, standing now like a man awaiting judgment, unsure of his purpose in a world at peace. Caney presents her with a golden parachute, a life of wealth and total autonomy. He restores the agency he previously compromised. This is his final examination, placing the key in the lock to see if she chooses the open sky or the safety of the bars. His posture is a study in suppressed agony, every fiber taut with the effort of letting go. He maintains that the decision is hers alone, absolving her of any perceived debt. It is the tragic paradox of a man proving his love through the act of self-exclusion. Ava analyzes this dark savior emerging from the debris of their shared history. He has constructed a safety net of absolute security. His willingness to vanish for her benefit is the final, poetic thesis she needs to reevaluate his entire character. The subject discards the exit strategy, choosing instead to bridge the gap between necessity and choice. She asserts that her presence is not a trauma response, but the organic result of a slow emotional evolution that matured over the last 30 days. A spectral light of hope ignites within Caney's gaze. Ava reclaims her agency, declaring that her heart is no longer under duress. By closing the distance, she incinerates the tactical contract of their past, beginning a study in voluntary devotion. The scene shifts to an intense, grounding intimacy. Vincent clings to her as if to anchor himself to reality. He confesses that her domestic warmth became the antidote to 20 years of psychological isolation and chronic emotional malnutrition. Vincent is paralyzed by a guilt complex, questioning his worthiness to occupy her light. Ava, however, rejects the narrative of victimization. She identifies him as her bulwark, not her master. She monitors the frantic cadence of his heart, seeking to stabilize his shattered psyche. Ava characterizes her history as a map of unrequited affection. Despite the wreckage, she proposes an architectural rebuild of their lives. Vincent responds with a kiss of primal necessity, a stark, authentic departure from the theatrical hollow of their original vows. Ava experiences a sensory resurrection, a flicker of life in nerves long dormant from the winter of trauma. Afterward, Vincent surrenders to a moment of raw fragility. He offers a clinical disclaimer. His mind is a fortress of old traumas, perhaps unsuited for the rhythms of a conventional life. After 20 years wandering a self-constructed labyrinth of isolation, the protagonist finally surfaces, only to be met by a partner who demands the shedding of every psychological armor. She seeks a transparency so visceral it stings, a raw exposure of the soul that mirrors the edge of a blade. Haunted by an internal deficit, he trembles at the thought of occupying the domestic stage under the unforgiving glare of reality. Simultaneously, she navigates the residual echoes of a predecessor's cruelty, her psyche still flinching from the specter of a broken trust. A heavy atmosphere of ontological insecurity descends as they recognize the precarious nature of their newfound serenity. While she views their shared terror as the ultimate catalyst for intimacy, he seals their pact with a silent physical vow, lifting her into a new space in a symbolic rite of protection. He prioritizes the restorative power of shared vulnerability over mere carnal impulse, acknowledging their long exhaustion from a life fueled by trauma and high-stakes survival. Her emerging wit signifies a psychological homecoming, a sign that her true essence is finally flourishing within the security of his orbit. Orchestrating a methodical retreat from chaos, he chooses the patient path of traditional pursuit to distinguish their bond from mere shared trauma. He places the innocence of the youth above his own desires, a calculated act of agency that serves as a profound, overwhelming testament to his devotion. In the quiet hours of spiritual dialogue, they construct a bridge toward a future illuminated by the sun, leaving behind the dark machinery of their past. She transitions from the base mechanics of staying alive to a grander narrative of self-realization, reclaiming a destiny once stolen. Her pursuit of advocacy represents the alchemy of suffering, turning personal wounds into a systematic force for societal repair. He reinforces this newfound autonomy by abdicating all authority over her, effectively dismantling the psychological shackles that once governed her every breath. A cathartic outpouring follows the startling realization that she is the sole architect of her own existence. As a mental sunrise displaces the long night of trauma, the distant sounds of a child's laughter provide the rhythmic proof that their sanctuary has finally achieved a predictable rhythmic peace. The kitchen serves as a crucible for a new kind of normalcy, where a former titan of the underworld finds himself humbled by the simple demands of a 6-year-old and a bag of flour. This evolution from a cold agent of force to a clumsy culinary novice highlights a beautiful expansion of his humanity. Amidst the ruins of a failed breakfast, the melodic sound of her amusement becomes the true sustenance. The rigid persona he once wore for survival dissolves into a genuine expression of joy, marking a total departure from the detached, predatory figure he was conditioned to be. She experiences a sudden realization that security is rooted in a selected kinship rather than mere legalities or blood. His ability to find humor in his own domestic failures serves as a healing antithesis to the self-absorbed tyrants who previously dominated her landscape. The child's easy acceptance of their charred meal signals the formation of a profound trust with the man who was once a source of terror. Watching them, she finds a quiet grace in the way they build a world through the small, repetitive acts of trying and failing together. Legal documentation brings a sense of ultimate closure as their antagonist withdraws into the wreckage of his own making. The shift from high-stakes combat to a mundane debate over breakfast signifies the quiet triumph of a reality where the shadows have finally been banished. She whispers a quiet affirmation of their status, her soul finally finding its level. When even the arbiters of the law recognize his fundamental transformation, it validates her radical decision to place her faith in a man who emerged from the depths of the criminal world. He surrenders his pride to the sound of a boy's mirth, embracing their woodland retreat as a space where external threats cannot penetrate. In this isolated pocket of time, they transcend their roles as victims of tragedy to become a unit learning the slow, steady rhythm of peace. Though the fishing lines remain still, the quiet space between the man and the boy is heavy with unspoken connection. Later, the hearth serves as a sacred altar where they offer up small, difficult truths as a way to cleanse the atmosphere of their shared past. Under the gentle warmth of lamplight, they begin the slow work of unearthing their buried selves, trading stories of lost art and secret passions. Their physical proximity is no longer a source of tension, but a deliberate, synchronized harmony that replaces the chaotic noise of trauma. The architecture of their lives no longer feels restrictive, as a simple meal softens the sharp edges of their collective history. Conversations regarding the deep past and archaeological remains anchor them into a domestic routine that feels both miraculous and terrifyingly standard. He praises her cooking with the exaggerated fervor of a true believer, a gentle deception designed to honor her efforts. In a room once dedicated to dark strategies, they now collaborate on a design for their future, turning a space of ghosts into a foundation for their line. With a simple signature, he erects a permanent financial fortress around the boy's potential. He adopts the role of father, not through the accident of biology, but through a profound, self-imposed obligation forged in the fires of personal transformation. He wages a silent campaign against the darker aspects of his own heritage, ensuring the child possesses the liberty his own mother was denied. This vast resource acts as a permanent defense, guaranteeing the youth will never have to submit to a master for survival. He dismantles a criminal legacy to fund a refuge for those broken by the world's cruelty. This new institution stands as a physical manifestation of his remorse, a grand structure built to catch those who are slipping through the cracks of a violent society. By placing her in charge of this mission, he transforms her past trauma into a strategic tool for the liberation of others. He provides her with a platform of immense power built directly upon the site of her greatest suffering, allowing her to lead with authority. His touch signals a total surrender of control, leaving the trajectory of her life entirely in her own hands. She realizes she has ceased to be a fugitive fleeing the flames, evolving instead into a guide who carries the light for those still trapped in the dark. She commits herself to repairing the very societal failures that once nearly claimed her. In the warmth of his rare, genuine smile, her final psychological defenses dissolve, leaving her vulnerable yet anchored in a profound sense of absolute security. Their transactional arrangement has matured into a connection of profound depth, yet the narrative shift toward the legal arena looms. He prepares her for the coming interrogation, where their private sanctuary will be scrutinized by professionals hunting for a single point of failure. She opts for the path of uncompromising truth, presenting their union as a complex mosaic of two damaged spirits finding a perfect fit. Their partnership is framed not as a deception, but as a masterpiece of mutual survival born from the debris of their former lives. Their recovery is a tangible reality that no legal skepticism can diminish. He traces his devotion back to the moment he witnessed her primal protective instinct, falling for the fierce guardian who finally decided to stop fleeing and stand her ground. She reflects on the moment he gambled his own safety for her sake, an act of perilous mercy that shattered her final doubts. Now her commitment is a quiet, recurring decision made in the stillness of dawn, long before the world demands anything from them. 90 days of tranquil domesticity follow as she masters the complexities of her new role. Meanwhile, the shelter he built stands as a soaring tribute to a mother he failed to save, now serving as a harbor for the vulnerable souls he finally can. The child thrives in their shared care, his vocabulary expanding to include the title of father without any external prompting. When the authorities arrive to inspect their lives, they find a warmth so pervasive it reads like a secular miracle in their final report. Their antagonist becomes entangled in the very machinery he once manipulated. At the final hearing, the court observes a woman who has shed her spectral, isolated past, standing with newfound strength beside a partner forged in the crucible of the underworld. When the court characterizes their beginning as a reckless venture, she feels a flicker of ancient dread, only to be steadied by the firm pressure of his hand. That physical connection serves as a ballast, grounding her as the judge contemplates the unorthodox journey they took. The official record confirms the child's prosperity, mirroring her own transformation into a woman of substance and power. She is no longer a creature defined by the act of enduring, but a figure who has successfully ascended from the ashes of her own history. The finality of the judge's strike signals the end of their long ordeal, confirming her right to parent. As the complex apparatus of the law grinds to a halt, she takes a long, deep breath, finally unburdened by the weight of a tragedy that has officially concluded. Their counselor stands in awe, of the improbable verdict. Vincent acknowledges the shift with a mere inclination of the head. For Ava, liberation arrives not as a weightless joy, but as a staggering bout of existential vertigo, the sudden, terrifying expanse of a life entirely her own. Conversation retreats into the sacredly mundane. They dedicate themselves to the masonry of family, a persistent labor of shoring up the ramparts they once built in haste. No more theater remains, only the rhythmic, quiet pulse of a father and mother finally inhabiting the present tense. Their forms coalesce, a final barricade against the intrusive gaze of the collective. The legal arena fades into a ghost of memory. They emerge into the sun, severing the tethers of surveillance and paranoia to focus on the arduous, silent cartography of healing. Their tomorrow is a structure anchored in the silt of shared trauma. Ava comes to realize that redemption frequently adopts the terrifying visage of a fever dream. She peered into the abyss of a predatory stranger and found the architect of her rescue, a bitter irony that now serves as the cornerstone of her existence. They have repurposed the debris of their lives into a sanctuary. 6 weeks of tranquility drift by like a hallucination. Then the ordinary morning is fractured. A knock at the entrance introduces a sudden volatility, a specter from the reality they thought they had buried beneath the floorboards. While Vincent manages the external world, Ava confronts Jennifer Chen. The woman is a visceral study in collapse. A livid hematoma spreads across her cheek like a crushed blossom, and her eyes are hollowed out by a weariness that has reached the very marrow of her bones. Jennifer has retreated from the predator, Marcus. She lingers on the threshold, her voice fluttering like a wounded avian creature clutching a lone suitcase. She is a soul in transit, her whole world distilled into the primal craving for a wall that offers shelter rather than a strike. Ava finds no cheap satisfaction in the sight, only a profound, vibrating resonance. Her own history is staring back at her through another's eyes. Recognizing the monumental, freezing bravery required to sever the leash, she draws the woman inside, providing the harbor she once sought from the heavens. The refugee is paralyzed by the unearned mercy. Ava invokes the ghost of a shared secret, the one that ensured Eli's survival. This refuge represents a debt settled, a narrative loop reaching its conclusion. In this predatory landscape, one shield must always beget another. Vincent enters, his perception sharpening into a cold diagnostic edge. Ava provides the summary of the catastrophe. Marcus, the name is enough. He scrutinizes the casualty, his intellect already drafting the maneuvers of a new campaign to fortify their island of peace. He extends his protection with the gravity of a monarch granting sanctuary. Their private residence becomes a forward operating base for their mission. Jennifer disintegrates into the safety of it, a structural collapse of the self, as the inhabitants begin the surgical work of reconstructing a shattered psyche. She recounts a narrative as ancient as dominion, the gradual intoxication of control, the sting of the verbal lash, and the definitive blow when she finally stood upright. She validates Ava's darkest intuitions. The warnings were prophetic. The beast in the tailored suit was precisely as monstrous as they had hypothesized. Ava contemplates the cultivated blindness of the upper class. High-functioning predators thrive within the brilliance of their own professional prestige. She is fluent in this choreography. The complicit family, the strategic isolation that transforms a mansion into a soundproof private purgatory. The survivor is a captive, dispossessed and severed from the world. Marcus's digital specters haunt her device, a relentless tide of intimidation meant to reel her back into the cage. She is a person categorized as property, struggling to locate the original self buried under the trauma. Vincent observes the meticulous nature of her flight. He operates with the cold efficiency of a clinician, already coordinating with the authorities. A restraining order serves as the first stone in the fortress he is erecting. The systematic demolition of Marcus's kingdom has officially commenced. He dismisses her financial anxieties, framing the cost as a personal obligation. Ava guides the woman to a chamber reserved for the haunted. Here, behind reinforced barriers, the painstaking task of relearning the mechanics of breath can finally begin. Jennifer lingers in her gilded cage of comfort, interrogating their motives. Ava views her through the transformative lens of a mirror. She prioritizes the heat of the pack over the glacial remnants of old animosities, extending a hand to the woman she once perceived as an enemy. The memory of Vincent's abandoned mother lingers in the corners of the room. Ava is the safety net he was once unable to weave. She characterizes this intervention as grace, a calculated aesthetic redistribution of the very mercy that once extracted her own spirit from the wreckage. Jennifer's 21 days of convalescence were a blur of clinical security. While Patricia's legal iron kept Marcus at bay, Vincent integrated her into his clandestine ecosystem, providing both a canopy and a vocation within his twilight network. Ava reconstructed the scaffolding of a life, restoring the woman's hijacked agency bit by bit. Young Eli observed from the periphery, his mind absorbing a fresh syllabus. The methodology of how the fractured are repaired and the discarded are reclaimed. The child bore witness to a strange alchemy, the choosing of mercy over convenience. When Jennifer attempted to offer gold for her deliverance, Ava gently declined, murmuring that the obligation must be transferred to the next soul caught in the gale. Beneath an amber sky, Vincent watched the boy inhabit the new garden, attempting to attribute the victory to Ava's singular virtue. She countered him with a tender gaze, defining their triumph as a canvas painted by 4 hands. Vincent spoke in the language of ledgers, dismissing his own heart as a mere business expense. Ava simply shook her head. She understood that their connection was tempered in the furnace of collective wounds, a fusion so absolute her spirit no longer recognized its own borders. She questioned if he regretted that first rain-drenched encounter at the diner. His negation was immediate and visceral. In this improvised family, the ghost of a man had finally discovered a pulse that existed beyond the cold arithmetic of violence. They ratified a covenant of mutual salvation. 7 months later, Haven House emerged, a stately, quiet manor providing 20 sanctuaries for women fleeing the long, obsidian shadows of their own classical tragedies. The aristocracy gathered in their finery, but Ava's resonance was the only sound that carried weight. She stood at the lectern, her gestures reaching toward Vincent and Eli, the dual anchors in a tide that once sought to pull her under. She spoke of the abyss, of a mother on the verge of annihilation. As the gravity of memory threatened to consume her, she anchored herself to Vincent's gaze, drawing fortitude from his silent, ironclad presence and the subtle movement of his head. She characterized a shadow that extended a hand when the heavens remained silent. That single, disinterested act of mercy had salvaged her motherhood and ushered her into the light of a reality she once dismissed as a cruel, impossible myth of safety. Eli's luminous smile served as the final punctuation to her journey. She proclaimed that Haven House was not a reliquary for trauma, but a foundry where the blueprints of a future could be forged from the scrap metal of a past. To request aid, she asserted, was the ultimate manifestation of defiance. She addressed the lenses directly, promising every invisible woman that they were recognized, they were cherished, and they were no longer isolated in the freezing dark. Mere survival had blossomed into a slow, aesthetic unfolding. Vincent's hand found hers as the ovation peaked. Ava whispered that their mothers, long since returned to the earth, would finally witness their children engaged in a work truly sacred and restorative. He inclined his head, his silence serving as a requiem for the departed. Ava had begun the tentative outreach toward her mother in Ohio. The dialogue was clumsy and the chasm immense, but the initial sutures of a fractured family were finally being drawn tight. On the journey home, Eli's voice rose in a frantic petition for a canine companion. The parents exchanged a silent, telepathic look, the unspoken dialect of a united front, while the boy pledged the moon and stars in exchange for a puppy. Vincent's quiet "we will see" was already a white flag raised to his son. That evening, they sat on the veranda in the profound stillness, inhaling a tranquility that was not on loan, liberated from the gravity of catastrophe or ancient debts. These intervals of quietude were their only medicine. But the external world encroached when Agent Chen made contact. The rule of proceedings were imminent, and Vincent would be forced to emerge from the shadows into the unforgiving light of the witness stand. His posture stiffened at the prospect of the public eye. To annihilate the brothers, he would have to expose his own throat, watching his legitimate legacy incinerate under the heat of his dark chronology and federal alliance. He trembled at the thought that his transgressions might infect his family. Ava refused the notion. She cradled his face and reframed his betrayal of the syndicate as a righteous crusade against the predators of the world. He murmured of his former atrocities, yet she perceived only his contemporary grace. To her, his existence was not a ledger of failures, but a grand architectural feat of reconstruction, a man erecting a citadel of safety where he once cultivated terror. She pledged to remain by his side within the crucible of the courtroom. When he doubted his inherent worth, she reminded him that this entire odyssey began because he chose to rescue a stranger when the only reward was peril. The trial was a tempest of flashbulbs. Vincent's testimony arrived as cold, incisive blades that dismantled the view law of defense, entombing them in iron for decades before the public's fickle fascination began to wither and dissipate. His surname became a descriptor for truths won through suffering. Eli turned 7 in a dwelling echoing with mirth, while Haven House welcomed its first 8 residents, women beginning the arduous, deliberate stroll back to the light under professional stewardship. Ava dominated her studies and the foundation with an identical fervor. Meanwhile, the predator Marcus traded his secrets for a mattress and a cage, eventually resurfacing in the world on a tight legal tether under the gaze of strict probation. Marcus's return was a faint, hollow reverberation that quickly died out. To him, the boy had been a mere trophy. To the boy, the man was a non-entity. Eli remained entirely oblivious to the total void left by the man who shared his genetic code. Vincent inhabited fatherhood like a tailored garment, the consummate guardian. But one Saturday, 365 days after their lives pivoted, Ava woke to a chill in the bed and a silence that felt weighted with a different category of secret. The sound of searing drifted from the ground floor, the resonant baritone of a man interlaced with a boy's high frequency. In the kitchen, she discovered them, a joint gastronomic endeavor displaying a quantifiable advancement in their fine motor control and thermal management. Ely performs his culinary duties with a jeweler's precision while Vincent manages the heat. The boy demands absolute stillness upon Ava's arrival, treating this meal as a fragile masterpiece and she, the sovereign, as an intruder on her own tribute. A shared platter of fruit serves as a secular altar. Vincent, typically the architect of emotional distance, reveals a fractured composure, his fingers betraying a tremor as he retrieves a small velvet relic from within his layers. He dismantles their shared mythology, beginning with that initial diner encounter. What emerged as a utilitarian arrangement to circumvent legal ruin has evolved into the only fragment of his reality that possesses genuine moral weight. a dense, luminous band replaces the thin emblem of their initial desperation. This shift signifies a departure from mere survival toward a lifelong covenant, a promise to inhabit the same physical and spiritual space until their final breaths. At the utterance of his inquiry, Ava's stoicism collapses into a cathartic release. The brilliant facets of the new stone stand as a testament to the complex, sacred refuge they have salvaged from their previous devastation. Within his embrace, the specter of Marcus Chen finally dissipates. She transcends the binary of victim and survivor, emerging as a woman fully integrated into a stable and unified self, defined solely by the love she receives. Adopting a fresh identity, she undergoes her final metamorphosis. During the ceremony, Patricia observes while young Eli manages the rings with a clinical solemnity, performing his duties with the gravity of a miniature monarch. A community of choice assembles to witness this formalization. Under a gentle natural light, they transition from a calculated alliance for survival into a state of profound and authentic emotional synthesis. She vows to act as his internal equilibrium, a serene port for the man who once anchored her. Refusing the role of a passive beneficiary, she commits to a vigilant partnership, reciprocating the protection he once provided. Vincent's pledge is forged in steel, devoid of sentimentality. Maintaining eye contact, he admits she transformed an isolated egoist into a man dedicated to a socially constructive and sanctified collective mission. Vincent contemplates the woman who once occupied the margins of existence, honoring the chaotic origins of their union. The roar of the assembly provides the final absolution for a connection sustained through immense personal cost. The festivities function as a meticulous performance of domestic peace. Vincent monitors the subtle joy in Ava's expression as they move across the floor, while the boy adopts the stoic, heavy silence of an emerging man. Ava's respiration falters, overwhelmed by the sheer statistical impossibility of this tranquility. Surveying the room, she recognizes fellow survivors who embody the physical reality of the sanctuary they have collectively engineered. This cinematic tableau depicts a clan rising from wreckage. Redemption here is not a singular event, but a grueling, iterative process of small, deliberate choices that gradually mend the human spirit, beat by beat. Vincent's attention bypasses the crowd to find the architect of his salvation. They inhabit the silent wake of their shared demolition, casting a backward glance at the fragmented versions of themselves they left behind. Their hushed exchanges resemble the desperate petitions of the submerged. As they rotate, their movement charts a path through their former ruins, two separate pulses finally achieving a unified rhythmic synchronicity. This social gathering serves as a testament to their psychological endurance. Ava retreats to the window, a solitary altar, observing her former traumatized self finally dissolve into the radiant warmth of the garden. He envelops her in his presence, his words a resonant frequency against her skin. Eliminating all ambiguity, he delineates their future with the permanence of a blood oath, something unyielding and absolute. They construct their sanctuary upon the discipline of the present. Perfection is discarded in favor of a daily renewal of commitment, choosing one another amidst the landscape of their beautiful, jagged psychological scars. They acknowledge that shadows will eventually revisit their threshold. Yet, watching the child play with a 3-month-old canine, Vincent perceives the forging of a protective barrier for the coming generation. The child assigns the animal a title, a brief, phonetic expression of unadulterated joy. Ava observes, struck by the impossibility of this life manifesting from the charred remains of her most profound terrors. She confesses in a fractured whisper that he truly perceived her. She recalls her existence as a mere silhouette in the rain, a void until his intervention pulled her back into a tangible reality. He dismisses the notion, his tone a deep vibration of immense gratitude. Claiming she was the true catalyst for his return, he pulls her closer as their silhouettes merge against the rising crescendo. A sudden cry from the child fractures the solemnity of their history. Together, they pivot away from the dim corridors of the past, stepping into the brilliant afternoon light and abandoning their ghosts to the shadows. A single instance of unexpected compassion derailed a terminal trajectory. This anomaly salvaged a trinity of souls, a casualty of violence, a displaced child, and a man who had long since discarded his humanity. He existed as a void until her radiance provided him with moral substance. This redemption acts like a fever, infecting every fractured spirit they encounter, as Ava views the dog's exuberance as empirical proof of hope. They form a complex mosaic of glass fragments, bound by a midnight anomaly. Originating in a cold gamble, their story demonstrates that love can outpace destiny, systematically overwriting every previous line of their personal tragedies. Her survival stems from a high-stakes wager on a stranger's hand. Each day represents a defiant rewriting of the script, a refusal to succumb to the catastrophic conclusion the world once dictated for her. Ava designs her future within the walls of Haven House, transmuting trauma into a clinic of refuge. Assuming the role of the architect, she utilizes her own scarring as a structural blueprint for leading others through the darkness. She understands that 12 hours can recalibrate a lifetime, and a stranger can become one's entire universe. Despair fuels this new objective. For true life to begin, the former self must perish in a savior's embrace, a nocturnal encounter transformed into a lifelong sentence of absolute devotion. Ava perceives that night as a divine intervention, now finding herself in a perpetual cycle of helping others to validate her own recovery. A spectral woman, a man burdened by violence, and a forgotten boy. From that midnight ink, they constructed an edifice of light, ensuring that the surrounding shadows never again breached their threshold.